welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and my guest today is Lyn Julius, who's an expert on Mizrahi Jews. She has written a book which is called Uprooted, How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight. And she's also a prolific writer, and she's also, I believe, the founder of Harif, the Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Welcome, Lyn.
Thank you very much, Elder. Thank you for having me.
I'm very happy that you could join us. This is we've just been talking. We're having a lot of fun. It's I mean, that's a lot of accomplishments. I mean, you have a lot. Again, you write often. You're fairly prolific in your writing, and you did a lot of research for your book. It looks like 10 years of research.
Yes, that's right. About 10 years of research. The blog, it grew out of a blog called Point of No Return. So it's sort of 10 years of accumulated blogging, if you like. I sort of after about 10 years, I had so much material and certain common themes started emerging.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, I would put the highlights in a book, which is probably the hardest thing I've ever done, actually, much harder than writing articles.
Okay, yeah, it is. It's not. It definitely is, because I keep thinking about doing the same thing, and it gets a daunting task. So I'm very impressed that you're able to do that. Could you just go over like a brief history of Jews in Arab lands, how that diaspora started and how they spread throughout the different Arab lands?
Right. Well, I think the main thing to remember about Jews from Arab lands, I mean, Jews from Arab lands actually is quite a controversial expression. I prefer Jews from the Middle East and North Africa because the Arab conquest and the advent of Islam occurred 1,000 years after the first Jews were actually settled in this region. So I think it isn't entirely accurate to talk about Jews of Arab lands, and certainly Arab countries is probably better than lands.
Right.
And so not to be too pedantic about it, but I think these Jews are basically belong to very ancient communities that go back to biblical times. For instance, the Jews of Iraq, they call themselves the Babylonian Jews because they go back to 586 BCE, which was the year that Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem and took Jews as slaves into Babylon. And there was a community living in Babylon ever since, continuously for 2,600, nearly 700 years.
So that was even throughout obviously the time of the Babylonian Talmud. There were obviously major yeshivas that were there at the time, and you're saying they never left. They pretty much were there up until the 20th century.
Absolutely, up until about 70 years ago. Yeah, and the same goes for the Jews of Yemen, extremely ancient community. The Jews of North Africa go back at least 2,000 years. And so I think you can talk about them being kind of embedded in the culture of the region. And I think that's why there's a lot of confusion. People talk about coexistence between Jews and Muslims, but what they really mean is symbiosis, because the Jews were there such a very long time that they influenced the surrounding culture. And of course, the influence of Judaism on Islam is a very good example, and the fact that the languages are so close together, Arabic and Hebrew. So, they really are unlike the Christian world, where the Jews were sort of comparative newcomers. The Middle East and North Africa is somewhere where the Jews are absolutely organic to the.
Mention it. It's true, that it's that we've seen that the Jews obviously have been there and been an organic part of the culture from again, but certainly pre-Islam, and you know, before the Arab invasion and influence, but on Arab culture. But I guess you're far more aware of how the Jews have actually managed to influence the entire region.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they are an indigenous people of that region, Christians or the Yazidis in that area. Other indigenous peoples have rights too.
Sure. No, that's a very good point. And plus, it's not only the Arab world anyway, because Iran is not Arab, and you know, I don't know if you're including Turkey,
Yeah,
but you know, that's not Arab.
yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I mean, you mentioned Iran. Iran is not Arab. And that whole area just north of Iran, you know, Azerbaijan, all the sort of ex-Soviet Islamic republics, they're actually part of the Babylonian diaspora. You know, I sort of see it as, you know, the Judeo-Farsi community really goes back to biblical times as well.
No, that's it. I did not know that. That's that you know that the Jews of Azerbaijan and et cetera have been really came from that same diaspora. That's interesting. I did not know that. And that's cool. The So how well? I know it's a loaded question and it's over 2,000 years, but how well did Jews integrate both in the, you know, when they were starting as well as after the Arab and Muslim invasions?
Yeah, well, um, a very interesting question. As you mentioned, like for instance, the Jews in Babylon, they had their glorious periods. They invented the Babylonian Talmud, or they wrote the Babylonian Talmud. There were Talmudic academies in Babylon, and that was just before the advent of Islam. And actually, under the Abbasid period, that was also a very glorious period, and there was a great flourishing of Jewish culture at that time. And people talk about the Golden Age in Spain, a sort of great synthesis of culture as well. So there were periods where the Jews did prosper and did make a huge contribution to culture, came to the region. The Arabs were in a very small minority, and the majority of peoples that they conquered were not Muslim, and so they had they were more interested really in the tribute of these non-Muslim peoples than they were in converting Jews and Christians to Islam. There was a status called the Dhimmi status, which you obviously know about. According to the Pact of Omar, the Jews and the Christians are actually inferiors and have fewer rights than the Muslims. But the essence of being a dhimmi was that the non-Muslims paid a tax. They actually paid the ruler of the day to protect them. They were not allowed to defend themselves. So it was a bit like a protection racket, you know, sort of paying the mafia to leave you alone, if you like. So this dhimmi status obviously institutionalized the unequal status of non-Muslims in the Muslim world. And of course, it was a handicap. There were certain humiliations and restrictions imposed on Jews in the Muslim world. But these were not always universally applied, and it very much depended on the ruler of the day. Some were much stricter than others. Others disregarded the dhimmi rules. So it did vary quite a bit. But I think if you want to define the status of Jews in the Muslim world, the best way to do it is to say that they were never sure of what the future would bring. Their status was always precarious. And therefore, when the colonial powers started increasing their influence in the Middle East and North Africa, the Jews always sought the security of foreign passports, for instance, and the security of knowing what their rights were. And the colonial powers were in a much better position to give them that security.
And that's an interesting point, because even now, if you look in Arabic, Algerian newspapers, they will regard the Jews that lived there in the 19th century essentially as traitors, because they accepted French citizenship, and because the French offered it to the Jews and not to everybody else, and maybe to a couple of other minorities, I'm not sure. And they look at it right now as a huge betrayal, and therefore they use that as an excuse for their for how they treated the Jews after that. I don't know how well the Jews did in Algeria beforehand, but they use that as an excuse afterwards.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But actually, it was the Algerian Jews were a special case, because they were the only Jews in an Arab country that were actually granted French citizenship. None of the other minorities were treated in this way, but it put them between a rock and a hard place, because, as you say, the Arabs and the Muslims started resenting these Jews, because they obviously were afforded more rights than the Arab Muslims, who didn't have French citizenship. But on the other hand, the white colonial settlers in Algeria resented the Jews as well for having accepted French citizenship. They didn't think they were worthy of it. But one important point I have to make, which is the Muslims in Algeria were actually offered a French citizenship as well, but they turned it down because they didn't want their personal status to be compromised. They wanted Islam to govern their personal status. So it is a misconception to think that only Jews were offered French citizenship.
Wow, I did not know that. There's, again, compared to Europe, I mean, probably Jews in the Arab lands had it fairly good. I mean, there were really horrific pogroms in Europe, but it wasn't ideal, and it wasn't idyllic the way that that it's being represented now by many Arabs as saying, "Oh, we always lived in peace." Can you give a couple of examples, even before the Farhud is obvious, but even before that, 19th century and before, of really bad times that the Jews were very much oppressed by their Muslim overlords and neighbors?
Well, if I may take issue with you a little bit, saying because the dhimmi status was a fact in the Muslim world, in a way, the Arabs and the Muslims didn't have to wage pogroms on the Jews, because they were already inferior and they already knew their place, much more so than in Europe, if you like. But having said that, there were pogroms. In fact, if you look at Morocco has a very good image nowadays, of being very tolerant towards the Jews. In fact, the king is always held up as a fantastic symbol of tolerance, and that the Jews themselves look up to him and honor him as someone who always protected them. But in fact, if you look at the historical record in Morocco, there were more pogroms there than anywhere else in the Muslim world, especially in the 19th century, which was a time of great instability and turmoil. And North Africa actually was notorious for occasional pogroms. When I say occasional, they're actually quite frequent. Like the Jews in North Africa lived in a mellah, which was a sort of ghetto, a Jewish quarter that was actually surrounded by a wall in many Moroccan cities, for instance. And you may ask yourself, well, why do they need a wall surrounding the Jewish quarter. And the reason was that they had to be protected from the power of the mob. And the mob did, have these forays into the Mela, in which they would loot, they would occasionally rape women, they would also kidnap women. I mean, this was a very big problem in the Muslim world, the kidnapping and abduction of Jewish women. It's a sort of dirty little secret, if you like. So that, I mean, they were exposed to the forays of the mob, especially in North Africa. And I don't think these were even documented, not unlike in the Christian world where, in 1391 or 1392, there was a particular pogrom in wherever. In the Arab world, there were these occasional forays into the Melas every so often, with mobs in search of loot, basically. And these Jews were really very vulnerable to that sort of thing, and they were at the mercy of the ruler of the day, and they, and hopefully the ruler would protect them in these circumstances, but not always.
Yeah, that's you're right. I mean, it's I don't know if there's do you know if there's any semi-comprehensive history of these sort of pogroms in the Middle East?
The problem is that the Jews never wrote their own history. There was very little written down up until the sort of 19th century, and you've got records, for instance, Benjamin of Tudela, who visited the entire region, and he documented each community, the size of each community, and that sort of thing. But there are documents, sort of in the archives, if you like. But these are not always written by Jews. So you may not get a particularly, let's say, unbiased view. I think Western historians started documenting the history of Jews in Arab countries in the 19th century, but before that it was a bit fragmented.
Was the Damascus blood libel of, I think, 1840 or something like that? Was that? I mean, the blood libel you usually think of as part of the Christian world, and I think this was also a Christian blood libel to begin with. But were there other similar blood libels, or not necessarily directly blood, but those sort of ideas like well poisoning and that sort of thing in the Arab world before that?
Well, you're absolutely right. The Damascus blood libel was actually started by Christians, and there were about 18 blood libels in the Ottoman Empire soon after the 1840 blood libel. But these ideas of Jews poisoning wells and using blood to bake batza and everything, these are Christian ideas that actually penetrated into the Muslim world. Especially, I think it was the Greek Orthodox Christians who were particularly anti-Semitic and brought these ideas into the Arab world. Yeah.
No, that was my impression as well, that especially in Palestine, that the Arabs were all too eager to accept these ideas, but it did seem to come that it looked like certainly in the beginning of the 20th century, the most rabid anti-Semites in Palestine were the Christians.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. I mean, you have to differentiate between sort of the Muslim attitude to Jews and the Christian attitude to Jews. The Muslim attitude to Jews was that Muhammad had defeated the Jewish tribes in Arabia, and they were no longer a threat. But they had to be reminded that there was a penalty for not converting to the ultimate revelation, which was Islam. And therefore the Jews were daily reminded, by these humiliations. They would They would be stoned. They would have to go past a mosque barefoot, or whenever they left the Jewish quarter, they had to take their shoes off. They had to wear special clothing. Like the yellow badge was not a Nazi invention. It was invented as part of the dhimmi status. So these are all signs that the Jews had to be humiliated and reminded of the fact that they hadn't converted to Islam. So, but ultimately they were not important. You know, they were just they were only important insofar as they paid taxes. You know, they paid the jizya tax, and that was important. But insofar as they weren't a threat, and they certainly were not powerful. But the Christian idea of the Jew was quite different. It was that, well, apart from the theological prejudice against the Jew, because the Jew had killed Jesus, there was this idea that the Jews had a secret power, or sort of magical power, or, and later on they were conspiring to dominate, or you know, this idea was very much a Christian, and then became a Nazi idea, really. You know, these ideas of conspiracy and control, the protocols of the Elders of Zion. This sort of originated in the Christian world, and then it penetrated into the Muslim world in the 20th century. You know, a Nazi influence penetrated the Arab world, and exported these ideas of conspiracy and control. And in fact, they're still rife today. And this whole movement of Islamism has its roots, a lot of it, in European anti-Semitism. For instance, you only have to look at the Hamas Charter, and you can see these ideas that the Jews, you know, started the First World War, they started the Second World War, they were behind the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. You know, these ideas actually came from Europe. Mm-hmm. They're not really, you know, Muslim ideas at all.
And yeah, and that's you're making a very interesting point, because it's the transition from Jews being powerless to having power, which is what happened in, you know, when Zionism started taking hold, and especially after 1948, ended up being a great incentive for the Arab and Muslim world to accept these conspiracy theories and this Christian style anti-Semitism, because that was the only way they could, you know, the Jews that were in such second-class citizens and were always considered weak dhimmis for so long, the only way that they could jive that with what was happening now would be to accept these ideas of you know, conspiracy theories and secret powers and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, it's the old dhimmi idea that the Jew had no power at all. They couldn't understand how a Jew who actually was not allowed to defend himself could suddenly win wars and defeat, you know, 7 Arab states. And as you say, they resorted to these conspiracy theories to explain Israel's great victory over Arab countries.
In the 1940s and 50s and through the 60s, when you know, there still were Jews in the Arab countries and they were being expelled, the Arabs at the time were not as careful as they are today to say, you know, Zionists. I mean, they were pretty explicit that it was Jews that they were going after, right?
Yeah, I mean, it all began just when Israel was established, or actually shortly before Israel was established. We know there was a plan by the Arab League to discriminate against the Jews living in Arab countries. And one of these discriminatory laws was actually to criminalize Zionism. So effectively, they conflated being Jewish and being a Zionist. And the thing is, how do you define Zionism? So, you know, you've got ridiculous situations where, you know, being in possession of a letter from Palestine, you know, you could be accused of Zionism as a result, or having a Magen David on a prayer shawl. Could that be Zionism? You know, all sorts of ridiculous situations where Jews could be accused of spying for Israel. And of course, because Zionism was a crime, you could be arrested, you could be tried, and you could even be executed for Zionism. And therefore, that led to trumped up spying charges. I'm thinking of 9 Jews were hanged in Liberation Square in Baghdad in 1969, on charges of spying for Israel after the defeat of the Six-Day War. And this sort of thing went on. Yeah. And it was all because, you know, they couldn't differentiate between Zionism and Judaism. And of course, even communists were accused of, you know, were persecuted in the end. Sure. Because of this failure to distinguish between Judaism and Zionism.
There was, I mean, obviously there was a huge influx of these Jews from Middle East lands coming into Israel after 1948. There was discrimination against them. I mean, there's no doubt about that, you know, as they were put into the camps. But it looks like, you know, I don't believe there's too much of that left over. Could you just go over that a little bit?
Yes, sure. I mean, yes, undoubtedly, there was social discrimination. There was a sort of contempt for their culture. And undoubtedly in the 1950s, Jews coming in from Muslim and Arab countries did come up against this. But as you say, it's much less now. There's an awful lot of intermarriage between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim. And one thing I have to say is that the fact they ended up in tent camps was not a deliberate policy by the Israeli government. Israel had no choice, really, because it was a very poor developing country, and it simply did not have the resources to cope with this influx of Jews, about 600,000 arriving virtually overnight and doubling the resident population of Israel, which was already 600,000. So they had no choice but to put these newcomers into tent camps. And by the way, they were not the only incoming refugees that were put in tent camps. There were Jews from Romania, there were Holocaust survivors, there were Jews from Poland, who also ended up in the Ma'abarot. But the difference was that they had a better chance of leaving, you know, as they left sooner than the Jews from Arab countries, because many of them received reparations from the German government, and therefore they were able to leave sooner than the other refugees who were from Arab countries.
That makes sense. I never thought about that, but you're right. Just a little that.
It's something I discovered quite recently, actually. I was watching a program on Israeli TV about the Ma'abarot, and that was one point they made.
No, that certainly makes a lot of sense. You know, a few $100 extra a month is going to make a huge difference.
And also, I have to say that this whole discrimination narrative can be politically motivated. The far left have kind of used it to sort of drive a wedge between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, to say the Mizrahim were torn away from their Arab brethren by the Ashkenazi establishment, you know, against their will, and this sort of thing. So, you know, you have to be careful, because sometimes, you know, bona fide charges of discrimination are not that at all. They are a kind of,
no, absolutely.
They're you know, they're made with a political agenda in mind sometimes.
And I see that plenty of that, again, looking through you know, my translated Arabic media. they will point to that and saying, well, look, the Jews are discriminatory against people who are not white or whatever. You'll see a lot of that. Your book cover the Ethiopian Jews?
No, I don't actually cover the Ethiopian Jews at all. Let me show you. I have two pictures on my cover. One is a Jewish actress who made films in Egypt. Her name was Camellia, real name Lilian Levy Cohen. And the other picture is of a refugee arriving from Iraq in a tent camp in Israel. Mm-hmm. So he looks a bit dark, but he's not an Ethiopian. Yeah.
But you didn't cover that in your book because it's it's sort of a parallel, not quite the same, but again, Jews living under Muslim rule, obviously a lot less connected to the other, to Mizrahim even. So they were even less connected to the rest of the Jewish world.
Well, the Ethiopian Jews are a bit of a special case. They were not living in a Muslim country because the dominant religion there is Christianity in Ethiopia. I didn't want to bring them into the picture because I really was more interested in the mass exodus of Jews from Arab countries after 1948. And there were sort of political implications, because I think if these Jews are essential to an eventual peace settlement, for instance, and they are also vital to understanding the exchange of refugees that occurred between the Palestinians and the Israelis. There was a reason why I concentrated on the mass exodus of Jews from Arab countries, to the extent that I don't even talk about the Jews from Iran that much, because their exodus took place 30 years later. So it's a slightly different case again.
Yeah. And that makes sense because, and I know that, Arabs are, again, when I read in the media, they're very upset at any sort of a equivalence between, what happened to the Palestinians and what happened to the Jews of Arab countries. But it's an extremely important comparison to make, because if for no other reason than to say, you could say what you want about what Israel did when they came in and how hard it was on them, but Israel still welcomed them as citizens. Israel still did everything they could to bring them in. Israel didn't treat them as people they didn't want. They didn't, they were happy to give them citizenship. And the Palestinians are deliberately, not given, except for Jordan, they were deliberately denied citizenship in Arab countries by, the Arab League said explicitly, this is important for your unity, and they buy this, and it's a huge difference. There's obviously no UNRWA for the Jews from the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely right. So that's why it is important, because in a way the Jews are a model for the absorption and resettlement of the Palestinian refugees. I don't know if you've heard of a book that came out recently called The War of Return. And that actually says that the main issue in the Arab-Israeli conflict is the right of return for Palestinian refugees. And if that's the case, then you have to bring in Jewish refugees into the argument. And you have to then say that two sets of refugees, not one, emerged from this conflict. Yes. And that there was a permanent exchange of refugee populations. And in fact, the numbers are roughly the same. Yeah. Jews who left the Arab world and Palestinians who left Israel.
Sure.
So if we want peace based on truth, we have to take account of the Jewish refugees.
Absolutely. And I did interview Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz a few weeks ago as well. So yes, it was a very good show. There was a very recent article in 972 magazine called Mizrahi Washing, the New Face of Israeli Propaganda. in which they're saying that Jews who are talking about the Mizrahi issue and saying what we're saying right now, how how they're integrated into Israel, is somehow a like everything else that's X washing is somehow an excuse to avoid people looking at Israeli crimes. I was wondering if you had any comment, or if you'd read that, or if you had any comment on that.
Yes, yes, I have, unfortunately. I had the misfortune of reading that article, and it just shows, to what absurd lengths critics of Israel will go. As you say, anything positive they turn into a negative. For instance, Israel's tolerance and protection of gays and lesbians, that becomes pink washing. Yeah. Anything at all positive becomes the exception to the rule. The rule being discrimination and oppression and this sort of thing. I think it's a sign that they are afraid of the success of the fact that people like Hen Mazzig have been raising the issue of justice for Mizrahi Jews, and they've been raising their narrative, if you like, raising awareness of their narrative, and therefore the only thing they can do is respond with terms of abuse like Mizrahi washing. Yeah. But it's a complete farce, and I think it's a sign of desperation.
And speaking of the same sort of desperation, there's clearly been a sea change, at least among Gulf states, in the attitudes towards Israel and the Jewish state. The UAE and Saudi Arabia. It seems to be mostly prompted by their opposition to Iran. But do you see this as something that could be permanent? That's something that could actually be a basis for a real peace between Israel and the Arab world?
Well, it's very interesting what you're saying, that there's been a rapprochement between these countries and Israel, as you say, because they have common interests, common strategic interests vis-a-vis Iran, obviously. But I do think, since these countries are not democracies, they do not really represent the will of the people who live in them. They only represent the governments and a sort of an elite of leaders, if you like. And, I don't think there's a popular groundswell in favor of Israel. Far from it. I think there is, we still have a long way to go before we can get a peace between peoples, and even those countries that actually have a formal peace treaty with Israel, for instance, Egypt or Jordan, the anti-Semitism at a popular level is really frightening. And it is not helped by the fact that the people are exposed to a lot of propaganda, and they're discouraged from anything that might approximate to normalization. So, of course, tourism is not encouraged from Egypt or Jordan. Cultural sort of relations are not encouraged. It's a cold peace. A peace between governments, if you like. I think we still have a long way to go before we get to real peace. And who knows? I mean, this rapprochement between the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. The leaders of these countries can, turn it off at a moment's notice. They can switch to a different course. I hope they don't, but like anything's possible. It isn't really more than a superficial rapprochement at the moment.
That's interesting. I'm slightly more optimistic, but not much. But slightly more optimistic only because I see, for example, I mean, again, it's still a small percentage, but the number of fans that the Israel in Arabic Facebook page and Twitter pages have, they're all of their social media. They have a lot of Arab fans, thousands, and as well as, you'll never see this in the Jordanian or Egyptian media, but in the Gulf media, there are far more articles, and in fact, even the Ramadan TV shows that are far more, you know, conciliatory towards Jews than what we've seen in the past. And again, how much of it is
Yeah,
from the
yeah, there
government?
has been a change. You're right. There has been a change, but I think a lot of people who are interested in Israel, who are even sympathetic to Israel, are expatriates themselves. You know, people who've actually had to leave Arab countries because they are dissidents, because they don't agree with the government, and I think one has to be careful not to kind of exaggerate, you know, their impact. You know, I still think the majority are probably afraid to express, you know, any feelings of sympathy, and they might even be punished for it. You know, and this is the problem.
I hear. Okay, well, this was very, very interesting and edifying. Thank you very much for being my
Well,
guest. I,
thank you for having me.
so again, this is my guest was Lyn Julius, author of, and I'll bring the book up again so people can see, author of the book Uprooted: How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight. And again, I very much appreciate you coming, and hopefully we'll do this again sometime.
Thank you very much, Elder.
Okay, take care.
Thanks.
Okay, we're out. Very good.